welcome everybody to this open water webinar on how to create your own paid newsletter. And, there really isn't a better guest I could have gotten for this one. I don't think there is no better guest in the world for this. It's Stacey Higginbotham, who, in full disclosure, I used to work with back at GigaOM, which is why I know that she is a preeminent newsletter person because okay, so here's the deal. Right now she is a policy fellow with Consumer Reports, but before that she was the founder of Stacey on IoT, an enormously successful and influential newsletter and podcast media empire that she ran just up until a couple years ago. Stacey, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. And I only quit in August of last year, so it's not even been a year that I've been out of the newsletter business.
Oh wow, I feel like
I know.
okay, so
Time flies.
time it's like wow, okay, I guess you're right. Well, listen, okay, so for those of people who don't know, give us a little bit of your background. Like you've been a journalist for a long time, and then you went on your own, but give us just sort of a brief history of how you got where you sort of your origins are and how you got into the podcast and into the newsletter business.
Sure. So I started a newsletter because I had things I wanted to say, and I didn't like the venues available to me in which to say them. And by that, I mean, I had been a journalist for about 25 years, and I worked with you at GigaOM. I also worked at a publication called The Deal. I worked for Fortune when GigaOM exploded. And so I had the ability, like I had always worked remotely, like since 2004. So I was very comfortable working for myself and by myself. And at Fortune, I really wanted to focus deeply on, at the time, it was the Internet of Things. And they were like, it's all right, but it's nothing great. And I really thought there was a business opportunity there. And so was like, you know what? I'm going for it. Why not? So after a year as a senior editor there, kind of just wanting to say different things, I started my own newsletter and I left in January. And in April, I put out my first newsletter and I produced a newsletter every single week for the next 8 years, with the exception of 1 week in December.
Oh, we're going to focus on that 1 week. Really, that's
Yes.
that's
It
where I
was a
want to begin.
planned break, but
Why did
yes.
you skip? No. All right. So here's the thing. So, all right. So you've been a journalist. You covered all kinds of technology, and then you were focusing on the Internet of Things. For people watching that may not know, that's like connected doorbells and smart blinds, and also, I think in your case, you would say more industrial things like sensors and communication devices and all kinds of doodads.
It felt like there was definitely an untapped market that covered like, and again, it was a very trade oriented newsletter. This is not like Stacey's opinions on parenting, which might be interesting for people, but I didn't have like a specific knowledge that was different from other folks or a perspective that was probably so unique that you needed to hear it, right? So I think it's really important if you're considering starting a newsletter and you want to make it a business that you have that sort of both the passion and the unique knowledge of something that matters to people. And we can talk a little bit about that later if you want.
Yeah, so actually let's start there. Like, so what I'm hearing you say is that you had been writing about a lot of things and you said, okay, this is an underserved area and I'm knowledgeable about it. I could start. But for someone watching, how would you know if you're in the right position to start a newsletter? Do you need both of those things or just one of them? Or where do you think is a good place, like for a kernel upon which people could build?
So I think you have to have a few of a, if there's like a newsletter trifecta, you have to have a very distinctive voice, right? So super being a compelling writer, having a good voice, having a topic of expertise that only you have. And okay, sure, there may be like 5 other people who know as much about the wide variety of things I do for the IoT, but it was really niche. Okay. I'm a super nerd. Um, and you have to have a sense of who your audience will be that you want to reach. And in my case, I wanted that audience to pay me money through advertising. So I needed my audience to be rich, not huge, because that was
Got
going
it.
to be my advertising base. So you need to have at least two of those things. I would never argue that I'm the world's most compelling writer, but I am incredibly, or I, no, I still am. I still am incredibly nerdy. And then I had an audience that already was reading me where I was and wanted more from me. And that's what gave me the comfort to be like, hey, I'm going to start a newsletter and I'm going to make it ad supported, even though a lot of people are starting newsletters at this time with a subscription support. And I think for a subscription support, I would have had to be probably a much more compelling writer. But we can talk about what people will pay for and who will pay for what.
We can get into that in a second. So okay, so you had an idea, you knew you had sort of the skills to convey it. And then within sort of the IoT space, did you have to narrow it down even further, or was something like that? I'm trying to help people figure out like how narrow do they need to be. Now I realize that it could be like it's all dependent on what you choose, right? Because some markets may be different, but for you, how thinly do you need to slice something?
So for me, and this kind of gets back into the making money part, I needed to focus on more the trade elements. So in part of that is because I only had a few ad spots. So I needed people to pay for spots that had a lot of money so that they would spend like 10 to $15,000 a month on an advertisement to reach my audience. Right.
Mhm.
So I started out, a lot of my coverage was like smart home stuff. And that was like fun, but that was never going to be something that people would pay a lot of money for. And there was a lot of that around. So instead, what I did is I still covered that and I still kept my voice within the industry there. But I also started covering like the deeper tech. It's also why I went into the more of the industrial side. So I followed where my audience needed to go, I guess, needed me to go.
Well, I
And
think
I
that's a
also had
no, go
oh,
ahead. Sorry.
and I also had people asking me, like, I also paid very close attention. Like, I started out with like maybe 6,000 subscribers, and I eventually built it up to like 20,000 subscribers. I mean, again, real small market, but um, I listened. They're like, "Hey, have you heard about this company? They're providing like the underlying chip or something, you know." And so I let them help me find the topics that I ended up writing about.
I think that's good expectation. You know, they say happiness comes from setting expectations, right? So you just illustrated how you were originally thinking, you originally wrote about consumer stuff, but then pivoted to more B2B trade stuff, business to business trade stuff, because there were already, you know, bigger companies out there that had more resources to reach that consumer market. And by identifying sort of the B2B, I think it's just important for people thinking about that to think about, you know, what, to your point, what type of audience they want.
Yeah. And if I wanted, I mean, like, you could be someone. I don't think a written newsletter is the best way to do product reviews. In all honesty, I think in today's day and age, like a YouTube channel would be more effective. Like you could come out and become like the new Marquez Brownlee, who is a wonderful technology product reviewer who kind of came out of nowhere on YouTube. Um, so you could create a media business around that. But I think the newsletter was good for explanatory things. Like in my case, it was deeply technical, but I think if you're like trying to convey a lot of data, that's another place where a newsletter could be helpful, or like comparing, I don't know, graphs, or like really breaking down topics. Not that you can't do it with the video format, but it's a I think it requires more planning. I don't know. Oh, sorry. Um, and so I don't know where I got lost there.
Well,
Sorry.
let's move from sort of the theoretical to the more practical, right? So if you want to start a newsletter, what do you need?
So the best advice I ever got was actually, Stacey, do you want to do this? Because I thought about doing it like 3 times a week. And someone was like, that is crazy. Start with the minimum, like start at a much lower minimum, and then you can add on to that later. And that was good because I realized I did not want to, probably like 3 months in, I was like, ooh, I do not want to be doing this multiple times a week. This is sufficient and works for me. Um, so that was probably the most important decision. But the other things I needed, you need a newsletter management program. So I used MailChimp because at the time that was I had written a newsletter for Fortune, so I was familiar with it, and it was before they were bought by Intuit, so they were really focused on the newsletter game. Um, Now there's like Ghost, Substack, there's a lot of options out there for people. And you need, depending on your business model, you're going to need the typical stuff like someone or you handle your own contracts. You're going to need business insurance. You're going to need, uh, if you host your own newsletter and you don't do like with Ghost, you can host your own newsletter, then you're going to need server capacity. But I mean, it's very doable.
So, but let's get into the nitty gritty here. Like, how many hours a week? So you went once a week, right? So how many hours a week did you when you started, and then when you were sort of at your plateau, right? And by that I just mean like it was a
It
machine,
was
you
my
knew what you were
peak, but the
doing.
peak stayed at a plateau, right? No.
Sure. Okay. Look, you never left. So how many hours a week did that typically uh run you, for lack of a better term?
So I wrote a beefy newsletter. I'm not going to lie. I probably should have split it up. It was, so my newsletter averaged between 2,500 and 3,000 words because, again,
Oh,
crazy. I
geez
know.
Louise.
No one do that. Okay. No one do that. So between reporting, uh, producing I mean, mostly my time was reporting and then writing. The business side of the newsletter probably only took like an hour a week. And that was mostly maintaining the website, going through and, answering comments and dealing with stuff like that. Um, and then contracts with my advertisers, things like that. So it wasn't the production of the newsletter probably took 20 to 25 hours a week.
Okay. I mean, that's still not nothing, right? Like if you consider people are thinking about this as sort of a side thing, right? Like just to get started, because people at first aren't going to have the same notoriety, or chances are people watching aren't going to have the same notoriety as you and the same history that was able to sort of, you were able to launch pad with 6,000 subscribers right off the get, right? And so then you could start monetizing that, but other people probably are going to have to work up to that. And uh I think also your email was very sort of, your newsletter was very journalism focused. Like, it was very like
It
steeped
was
in
super.
journalism, right? So there was a lot of
Yeah,
original reporting. There was a lot of work that went into it. So you might be a bit of an outlier in that regard.
totally. Like, if I were doing a newsletter, like if I wanted to do a more casual newsletter, or I wanted to write a newsletter, like I'm doing advocacy around cybersecurity for CR. That's my job. If I wanted to do a newsletter now around like cool things in cybersecurity, I probably wouldn't do the original reporting. I'd be like, I found this, I found that, I found that. And it might take me 4 to 5 hours a week. Whenever I was on tap to do the Fortune newsletter, that probably took 2 to 3 hours to put together.
Yeah.
You'd write your intro essay on whatever you want, and then, you'd pick some news items.
Aggregate other things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people who are looking at platforms? Now, I know that you're sort of out of it, but like, so I ran a paid newsletter for a while on Substack, and Substack made it super easy to get up and running. You could do it for free. They had all kinds of things. Do you have any insight in terms of like MailChimp is one way to go? There's also Beehive. It just seems like there's plenty of tools out there for people to sort of get started and to get going for pretty low cost.
So I would caution when you're thinking about a newsletter, a lot of the newsletter content needs to go on the web somewhere. Well, you have to make that decision. Like it's not a given that your newsletter content will be on the web and will be searchable. So like with Mailchimp, they didn't put they had a URL that you could go to where you could read the whole newsletter, but it wasn't indexed on search engines. It wasn't, I mean, it basically didn't exist at all, right? So I also had to have a website that I would pop my newsletter content on. And I don't know, with Substack, you have the Substack site, but I would caution anybody who's doing a newsletter to have their own site where they put their content, both because that way you can access it even if the company shuts down, like even if Substack or Beehive or whatever. And also for SEO and indexing purposes. So I don't know, like MailChimp was expensive and cumbersome towards the end, and I would not choose it again. I would probably want to host my own newsletter. Um, but that's kind of where I would be.
Yeah. You can do custom domains on Substack. That much I know, right? And I'm assuming like our friend Yanko runs the Low Pass. He was a guest on here a couple of weeks ago, and I think he does it through Beehive.
He
So
does.
there are kind of tools, but to your point, the other thing is having your content. If something happens to the company, what happens to all your content, which may not matter when you have 3 episodes up, but when you get to 300, and you have an archive, exporting that might not be as easy as you think.
And if you have a website or something like that, you do have to pay someone or you have to maintain it yourself. So I just did a WordPress site. Other people could do, I don't know what all
Sure,
the cool kids
there's
are
like
using today.
Squarespace. There are all kinds of things.
Squarespace. But so you'll want something like that. And then not that I want to bum anyone out, but you should also think about like what happens when you end it. Like ending my newsletter was I still maintain and pay to maintain the website where all my stuff is hosted. Um, so there's also all of that associated with it. And, you know, I would also say there's a lot more rules about how you treat your list and things like that that's worth noting. Um, and we didn't really talk about things like that, but I don't know how things like Beehive or um, Substack handle like your list. Do you own your list or do they kind of
That's a really
have
good
it?
question. Yeah,
You should
like what
always
can
own
you?
your list.
Yeah, that's just I think that's something people might not think about, right? Like the portability of it, the ability to do with it what you want to do with it. Let's talk about business models, because you can go with the subscription route, right? But that requires a lot of people. You can go with advertising, but that probably requires its own form of help. What can you tell us about different business models and different business models that you tried, um, and were able to make work? And what are some of the things people might not know about them?
Sure. So I like if you're going to start a newsletter, the two most obvious business model, actually there's three. Um, one is advertisers, which is what I ultimately went with. Other is subscription. Those are the two we most commonly think about. And then there's this sponsorship model. And a couple people, if you're really knowledgeable in your industry and you have somebody who like really wants to sponsor you, basically they'll pay you like 100K, 200K, however much a year to produce a newsletter, and they're basically the primary sponsor. So I've known two people who've done that. It's kind of like a bespoke publication model.
So that would
Um,
be something like X newsletter brought to you by
by
so
Intel.
and so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, or by whatever company. And you know, the journalists who did those actually wrote into their contract that they could write about competition and things like that. So if you're thinking of a more journalistic one, that's something to consider. But like, let's say you're like an influencer or you have a lifestyle, I don't know, you're a fitness trainer and you want to, produce a fitness newsletter. You might be able to do it under the aegis of like I don't know, a gym or I was going to say Peloton, but they're not making money now. So don't do that. Um,
Like if you
not a
want a
good
very
option.
short-lived newsletter.
Um,
No,
in
sorry.
this,
I did.
yeah, I'm like, eh. But for the subscription side, you know, there's for both subscription and advertisers, there's two ways to think about it. You can go mass or you can go, I'll call it money because I went with money. So mass is people will not pay a lot, but you will reach a lot of them. So if I were doing a subscription there, I'd have something like, I don't know, I'd pick something popular that people really like a lot of people want to read. And I'd figure out how many people I need to make my particular amount of money. And I'd come up with a subscription plan based on that, right? And the idea is when you're going mass like that, you're probably not going to charge a whole lot a month or a year for your newsletter. Um, if you're going mass in like an advertising model, you need even more people. You need like 500,000, a million, and you need to be able to show that you can drive those consumers that read your newsletter to make purchases. And that is hard, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, if you go for money, you need to have something for the trades, basically. So you need to have either inside information that people with money are going to pay money to get access to your information, like scoops if you're a journalist or that sort of thing, or you're just smarts. Like stratechery would be an example of maybe a money. Like people will pay. I don't know how much his newsletter costs, Ben Thompson's newsletter costs, but people pay a lot of money because they value his opinion, um, and it's narrowly targeted and very good. Um, so, and on the advertising side, it's the same thing. I had like the CEOs of these smart companies, of the industrial conglomerates, they read my stuff. So I could go to my advertisers and tell them, look, only 10 people are going to click on your ad, but the 10 people who do it are the people who are going to literally be buying your stuff. So I
Yeah.
actually had one of my advertisers, they got a giant, they now are the underlying IoT platform for Home Depot. And so for them, it was a very easy decision to pay. I think they paid like 30,000 for a couple months, right? And that paid off hugely for them. And
Yeah.
those are the kind of, that was the kind of business model I had. I tried the consumer business model for a couple things, but you know, the people who are reading my newsletter weren't reading it for the best to buy a smart IoT doorbell. They were reading it because they wanted to understand the next like generation of wireless technology.
Yeah.
Um, so they didn't click on the doorbell ads, even though it was expensive for the doorbell guys to be in my newsletter. So it just didn't work out for them.
So I want to talk to the extent that you can, right? Understanding that there are a lot of variables in here, but is there sort of a threshold people should think about before they even start considering advertising? Like, I understand that you were hitting a niche, right? So you needed a smaller amount because you had that, right? But should, in people's minds, do they need to hit 10,000 subscribers? Do they need to hit like at what point would an advertiser go like, "Oh, hey, maybe, don't talk to me until you hit X."
If the bigger advertisers, they're not going to talk to you until you hit X, right? You're not going to be able to get like Anderson. That used to be a consulting company. You're not going to be able to get IBM's magic enterprise software dollars without a significant following. Um, if you're super niche, you might actually like if you have only 500 subscribers to your newsletter, but you're writing about, I don't know, education, like buying educational products in schools. So like technology in schools. And your audience are people who actually purchase technology for schools, but there's only 500 of them. That might be okay. So it's truly a question of audience quality. But finding those people is going to be hard. Bless you. Uh, and so like a lot of our advertising initially was inbound. Like we just people were like, "Hey, can I advertise in your newsletter?" Which was really nice because I didn't have to go out and find them. Because that's another thing we haven't talked about, which is like if you're going to go with an advertising model, you have to go find your advertisers.
Yeah.
And people don't usually send you an email and be like, "Hey, I love your newsletter so much. Can I spend a lot of money on it?" Uh, and the other thing to think about is I actually had the newsletter and a podcast together.
Okay.
And
Yes, you did.
so, yeah, so the podcast actually helped, like being able to bundle my ad buy across both of those products helped. I would not
Okay.
be able
Well,
to charge so much otherwise.
got it. So having that extra media in the podcast form allowed you to sell sort of like instead of just having an ad people could click through, they would hear your voice talk about a particular product. So you were probably able to upsell them on different things, having that companion piece. But that did mean more work, right? Like it's in that case, you're not just doing a newsletter. Then you've also got to produce a podcast each week. You've got to get guests. You've got to, edit it together, which you can hire someone to do, but that costs money. So it is additive in your case, but it's also a lot more work.
Okay, so the 20 to 25 hours a week, that also included the podcast. And,
Okay.
they were synergistic. My reporting for my podcast and finding the guests and things like that, it worked across both platforms because they were about the same thing.
I wanted to ask you sort of a tactical question, which is when you were writing your newsletter, and then, we talked about the importance of having it on the web. How much were you writing for SEO versus how much were you writing just because you like this headline? Like, how much did you need to start writing for SEO? Um, how much did that creep into how you wanted to write something?
I never considered SEO, and that was actually bad for me. So I would not recommend, like, the only reason I could do this is because I had an established audience who knew me. But when it came to things like SEO, I didn't think about it when I was putting on the web so much. Every now and again, I would. What I did do, though, in the newsletter, I gave people, and we can talk about how to grow your audience in a minute with the newsletter if you'd like. Um, there were some things I always did in the newsletter, not necessarily for SEO, but for boosting subscriber and open rates. So I did do some A/B testing, um, and of like my newsletter headlines.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Okay. So it is. So don't be like Stacey.
don't be like
Write
me.
for
No,
SEO.
it's. I mean, or at least consider it. I'm old.
Yeah, I get it. We're setting our ways. I like this headline. I like this pun. I don't I don't I don't I don't want to write, a super long headline that explains everything.
Well, I also like my audience was in the news. My audience for the newsletter, they were people who I wanted to catch their attention, but I didn't necessarily care if they could find it on the web. Like my readers came, like, let me into their inbox. So I didn't want to do something super bland if I was in their inbox. I wanted to give them a little bit of personality and fun, right?
Let's talk about that actually. Like how do you cut through how does someone cut through the clutter of an inbox? Everybody gets tons of emails every day right now. Obviously, people have subscribed to you, so that's an active sort of opt-in. But even then, like I subscribe to a bunch of newsletters, but I don't necessarily click on them every day because I'm sort of like, it doesn't seem that interesting, or I'm just not in the mood for it today. Do you have any advice for getting people to actually open the emails?
So I did A/B test headlines. The shorter the headlines, the punchier the headline, the better. That was always, and by headline, I mean the subject line. Sorry, the subject
Sure.
line
Yeah,
for
no,
the.
yeah, okay.
Um, and then I think also my newsletters were a little evergreen. Like I tried to make them, I mean, they only came out once a week. They came out on Friday. MailChimp actually had some tools that would optimize your send time. I don't know if Substack would have that, but it actually looked at like when you sent your emails, when do people tend to open them?
Oh,
And
that's helpful.
yeah. And I think 30 to 40%, depending on when it was, of my audience was actually overseas. So, like, if I sent something on Friday at like 9 in the morning, it's 5 o'clock on a Friday in Germany where I had a huge
Right.
audience and they're not looking at it. Um, so uh, my content was such that people would open it and read it later on the weekends. And I think that was partially because like people liked my content and found it valuable. Um, but I do think, I don't know. I did use those tools and I tried to test different things and it did make some impact on it.
Well, I think it's important just this sheer like, hey, shorter and punchier, generally always going to be better.
Yeah, and but don't go. You have to give them some clue of what's inside. And if there was a
Right.
news event that happened that week that I could tie it to, I totally did that. Like if people were talking about something, I tried to put it in the headline. Um, and yeah,
So let's talk about how you grew your audience. Is it just consistency? Is it just showing up every week? Or what are the other things? Did you do some growth hacking, as they say all over LinkedIn?
I did. Um, and I should clarify, I didn't do this. I had my husband do this for me because I am not a growth hacker in the manner that my husband is. So what I did, or what he did, is first of all, when I said I was starting a newsletter, a bunch of people signed up. And prior to the newsletter, I had the podcast. So I advertised it on the podcast, and that's where I got those initial 6,000 subscribers. Um, and then from there, uh, I did campaigns on Facebook because they were very cheap at the time, and uh, they're like-minded. So I gave them my list of subscribers, and they found other people that were like those people, and they
Oh,
advertised the newsletter to them, and that worked really well. Um, we also tried things that didn't work. We tried a referral kind of system where, like, if you sent 5 people to the site, I would do something nice, or I would buy you like a smart home gadget or something. Um, and that didn't work super well, although at the time that we did it, we already had grown quite a bit. And I think that was partially because if you liked the newsletter, you really liked it, and you probably already told the people that you want to tell. And those people, like, I think it would probably work better with like more consumer focused thing, but my audience, my industry was so niche and small, I don't think it was like super effective. Um, and then we also tried a few. Oh, this is actually really helpful. If someone was a guest on the podcast or I featured them in the newsletter, I didn't do this every week, but I would send people links to, I would be like, hey, your article came out today. Feel
right,
free to
right.
share it on your socials, right? And actually, that's super effective. Uh, so it's just kind of time consuming and painful.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. So to recap, this has all been super great. So to recap, find your niche, decide if you're going to be like B2B or B2C and adjust your expectations accordingly.
Mass or money.
Mass or money, commit. So you gotta commit to it. You can't just show up, every other week or something like that. You got to commit to doing it. Uh, and then, short, punchy subject lines that are relevant to what's inside. Is that pretty well recap?
Yeah. And also have something to say.
That's right.
No one's
Sorry.
gonna
Yes.
sorry, no one's gonna let you into your inbox if you're just not saying anything to them. So do have a point of view, do have facts, do have something that compels people to open your email.
Have a take.
Yeah.
Well, as we used to say, like people can get their news from anywhere, but they sign up for, someone's take or opinion on it or their style of writing or whatever, right? It's whatever that unique thing they bring.
Yeah, and if you're doing the newsletter to like market something, because there's plenty of companies and stuff that have newsletters to market. Like, I don't know if that's something people are thinking about, but yeah, have personality. Put your personality in.
Well, I'll go out and get one. Stacey Higginbotham, thank you so much for being a guest today. You founded and then grew to a big empire, the Stacey on IoT podcast and newsletter. And now you are a policy fellow with Consumer Reports. Thank you so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to.